All right. I am so pleased to say that I am speaking today with none other than the illustrious premier children's literature academic, Leonard Marcus, live and in person. Leonard, thank you so much for talking to me today.
It's great to be here, Betsy. Thank you for
Yeah,
doing this.
I should say before we even begin, let's just go a little bit through your career. You have done absolutely everything, served everywhere. You are in Bologna one moment. You are creating the ABC of It, that exhibit at New York Public Library, the next. Um, you have a literary archive in the collection of the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. You teach at New York University and the School of Visual Arts, and of course have written many books, both for adults and children
Yep.
over the years. So yeah, here those are your bona fides, as they say.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, but of course the whole reason that I'm talking to you today is your most recent exhibit. So
Hmm.
at the Eric Carle Museum is Click Photographers Make Picture Books, which is the very first, and I'm sure it's not the first ever exist, but it's the first at the Carle that I've seen that
Hmm.
features photography,
Hmm.
um, specifically photography in children's books.
Hmm.
And it talks about the history. And I just want to start off by asking you, how did this exhibit come to be?
Well, I've been interested, it turns out, in photographically illustrated children's books since I was 4 years old. One of my two favorite books then was a golden book called Laddie and the Little Rabbit, and it had color photographs. It's about a brother and a sister who had a pet dog and a pet rabbit. And I desperately wanted a dog for myself, but my mother liked her furniture too much, so we couldn't have one. And so I would literally dream my way into the pictures in that book at night and replace the boy in the pictures with myself, just as Buster Keaton in the movie The Projectionist steps into the big screen in the movie theater because there's something that's happening inside the story of the movie, which is so much to do with what he needs in his own life. So I made a really deep connection to photography at a very early age, and I maintained it. When I was about 12 years old, I used to photograph copies of Life magazine because it was a sort of clever way of taking pictures of famous people without having to find them.
You
And
weren't alone.
no, and in college, I curated, or I wrote about Ansel Adams for the literary magazine, and then when I moved to New York and was doing a lot of work at the Donnell Library, which is where I met you, but I as a researcher, I curated some shows for the showcases, and one of them was about Edward Steichen's 1930 book, the first picture book, which he did with his grown daughter for 2-year-olds, based on the thinking at the Bank Street College of Education. They thought of photography as the illustration medium of the real world, and they were all about giving young children chances to think about the world around them. So illustrating a picture book with photographs seemed like a great idea to them, though, as you know as well as I do, it hasn't been the general rule that people have thought photographs were an ideal choice for picture books.
I'll be asking you about that later, but
Yeah,
yeah, correct.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I've been a trustee at the Eric Carle Museum since the very beginning, and I've curated a number of shows there. So I was really reaching into something that went way back in my own life to investigate and explore, and being very mindful of the fact that surprisingly little attention has been given to photography as an illustration medium for children's books.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's partly because people have had big debates, and this is true in the fine arts world as much as it
Right.
is in the children's picture book world. Is photography not even art? Is photography illustration? So you're at
Hmm.
the picture book, the illustration museum.
Hmm.
Is, did you have you faced any pushback? I mean, what is your take on photography as illustration?
There was a little bit of pushback, but I said, how is a photograph as a multiple image different from a lithograph? And I think that's a pretty compelling comparison to make in terms of the case for seeing it as art. As for the fact that it's, an image sort of pulled out of the real world, well, somebody is doing the pulling with a lot of, thought and a sense of design, and things are being chosen and left out and curated. And if I think when you really think about it, photographs are really not that much different from any other visual art form. When the camera was invented in the early decades of the 19th century, people said, how can a machine produce art? That was one of the big arguments. But then photographers responded by finding all sorts of ways of complicating what they were doing, in part to make the claim that what they were doing really did have aesthetic value. And one of the things they did was to pose characters in costume and create painting-like tableaus, dramatic tableaus, which related both to theater and to the history of painting. And say, well, look, see, doesn't this look like art to you? So, and that began to happen early on in the making of books, illustrated books for children too. Some of the first photographed illustrated books were not pictures of the, literal pictures of the real world. They were posed images, theater images, really, of invented worlds. So it showed that photography as illustration could be as much rooted in fantasy or other forms of make-believe as in documentary fact.
Well, now this brings up a fascinating question. When you were selecting who would you place in this particular thing, you had the choice of people who are first and foremost, they work with children's books, but then there are the fine artists who made picture books as well. So Cindy Sherman and William Wegman, and you had, I don't know that Sally Mann never did, thank God, but I'm just wondering, like, how did you balance that out in terms of how much of your show is fine artists who have done photography in picture books, but that's not the gist of their career, versus people where that is the gist of their career?
Well, I mean, to me, that wasn't the main issue, except for in the sense that people were much more likely to recognize the names and work of the fine artists than those who have apart from the people who are immersed in the children's book world, who everyone would know who Ta-Nehisi Coates is among children's book people, but most other people wouldn't. Even though she was in the Family of Man exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in 19.
Was she really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Oh.
But of the big sort of marquee names, we have Edward Steichen and William Wegman. Wegman represented by a number of prints on the wall, Steichen by first edition of his children's book, and Cindy Sherman. Some of the others are represented by books in showcases or in bins that we have for browsing. But the way I really thought about it was to ask myself, how are photographers thinking about photography as an illustration medium, and do the pictures fall into certain groups in terms of their ambitions and their approach? And what I ended up deciding was that there were really three basic ways that photographers have brought photography into the picture book or the illustrated children's book. One was documentary photography, a book about life in Mexico, or a book about the life of a tree, of a frog, wherever it might be. And that's a very old use of photography, both in and out of children's books. And interestingly, in the 1930s and onward, Life magazine was putting photo essays like that into millions of homes all around America. And some of those photographers migrated to the picture book world when Life magazine disappeared. So there are people like George Ancona who have a fine art background, but people just don't know about it.
That's really
Anyway, so there's that, and then there are the what I called photo theater, photographs in which the photographer has arranged a scene and then captured it on film. William Wegman would be a good example of that.
Oh yeah.
And of course, there are many others. Then the third category grew out of the Steichen book from 1930, and that is what we call concept books. And Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the heirs to Steichen's legacy. that is a book that illustrates an idea visually using photographs in a very focused way. Often those books are for very young children. You know, they might be a counting book or an alphabet book or a book about the difference between up and down. You know, but when you look at the photographs, they're really wonderful. I mean, Tana Hoban was a fabulous street photographer.
Well, in Tana Hoban, what's so odd is, okay, so they're color, full color, and of course, and of course, early photography in children's books was black and white generally.
Right.
You know, you got JT with Gordon Parks, and you've got Lonely Doll, which I will be asking you about that, and you know, all these things. And then at some point, the technology, either of the printing technology, and you can clarify that for me. I think both the actual photography itself technology and the printing technology and how much color you were able to put in a picture book sort of changed that. Tana Hoban, remarkably, I would say, color dates quicker than anything else. And yet her books do not. They are obviously from the past, but they seem timeless at the same time. And I don't know how she managed that. But can you talk a little bit about just the changes in technology and how that affected children's books?
Yeah. Well, you know, photography is often dated back to 1839. That's disputed, but roughly a good starting point. The first children's books to have photographs in them in any way, shape, or form came along in the 1850s. At that point, there was no way to reproduce a photograph in the page of a book. And what people would do would be to have a photograph and then make a very detailed wood engraving based on the photograph and then print that. So for instance, when Abraham Lincoln was a very widely photographed president, but when his image appeared in Harper's Weekly or some other major publication, it'd always be in the form of a wood engraving based on a photograph. It was around the 1880s or 90s that the technology came along, with the dot matrix being the key to the whole thing, that photographs could actually be reproduced as photographs in print matter. And there was a limited way that you could have color, but that didn't really happen until much later. And Tana Hoban's early books from the 1970s to the late 80s were in black and white. And she switched to color around 1990. Yeah.
Really, that late?
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, there was a huge shift in children's book publishing then. Prior to that, if you were an illustrator in any medium, you had to do an apprenticeship of 5 or 6 books in black and white to show that you were, you know, good to go. And then they would maybe give you some color. But after the late 80s, color became a selling point, and the scanning technology made it a lot cheaper. So from that point onward, it was the more color, the better.
I'm just fascinated by that fact that you had to apprentice to earn color for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, everyone, Maurice Sendak, everyone had to.
Yeah, I was thinking like Maurice Sendak was the first thing I thought. I was like, oh, he did have a bunch of black and white books in his early.
Oh, absolutely.
Days.
Yeah, and you know, my wife Amy Schwartz started in the early '80s, and her first books were all black and white. That was
and Mr. Jones. Yeah, I love
exactly.
and Mr. Jones. My favorite.
Yeah. So that's you know, photography, but also drawing and painting and everything else. There have been these periods when it changed. Yeah. The color's relatively new.
Yeah, no, it is true. And of course, when I'm talking about technology changes, and of course, the most obvious one is Photoshop. And so, do you, to what extent do you have Photoshop in the exhibit?
Absolutely. Well, a good example of that would be Nina Cruz's books. I think she may have been the first photographer to do that in children's picture books. But
with a major publisher,
Yeah, to me, the most interesting thing about it is it's really a new way of doing what the early photographers were doing when they were creating posed images. You know, I mean, you're just creating the scene in your computer rather than doing it on a tabletop and then photographing the result. In both cases, it's images being manipulated to arrive at a certain, you know, narrative result.
Oh, that's very much true.
Yeah.
To what extent is the exhibit fiction versus nonfiction? You touched on how, and you know, there were lots of rudimentary, like, you know, fact books. But do you
Mhm.
have any contemporary nonfiction photographers in the exhibit at all?
Oh, yes. Well, and I should say we have photographs from 8 different countries, including China.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's great.
There's a photographer named, I hope I remember his name correctly, Jin Yi. And he is a nature photographer who went up into Mongolia and photographed a reindeer herding family. And we have these
Oh,
incredible color photographs from him. And then we have from mid 20th century black and white photographs by the great animal photographer of that era, known by the one name Ela,
yeah.
Ylla, Camilla Koffler, who collaborated with, among other people, Margaret Weiss Brown and Jacques Prévert on picture
Yeah.
books for kids. And you can argue, I mean, often you can argue whether the book is fiction or nonfiction, because, I mean, she's photographing, in some cases, animals in the wild, or animals certainly as in, I mean, she had a kind of Jane Goodall approach to animals. She
Yeah.
saw them as individuals, and she looked for the expressions on their faces. So, in a sense, she was a sort of psychological realist when it came to taking images of animals, and yet she sometimes captured them in whimsical situations. So there's a mix
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. Her books are
Also,
large too. Yeah.
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Another one that I just want to mention, his name is maybe not known to everyone these days. Peter Buckley was a friend of
Oh,
Ernest Hemingway and was kind of a swashbuckling world traveler. And after World War II, in which he had participated as a member of the army, he wanted to do something to make the world a better place for the future. And he came up with the idea of doing photo essays about the everyday lives of children in different countries, so that children would
oh,
get to know about each other and see each other as friends rather than potential enemies. And he created a whole series that went into publication, I think, around 1952. Franklin Watts was the publisher, and he was one of the major nonfiction publishers for, especially for libraries and schools in those days. And these photographs are spectacular. And we found Peter's negatives at the Harry Ransom Center of the University of Texas in Austin. So they, took him very seriously as a photographer. I mean, he's right up there with Allen Ginsberg's papers and Arthur Miller's papers. But he's not very well known today. And he is an example of someone who made a decision that it was more important to be making picture books than it was to be trying to be shown in a gallery, because he was thinking about the future of the world. And then, interestingly, there's a book in the showcase, one of the showcases from Sweden, which is based on the very same premise by a well-known Swedish photographer. And that series was edited by Astrid Lindgren,
oh,
who was also an important editor of children's books, as well as
I didn't know
well
she
known.
edited.
Well, I know.
Oh,
Yeah, she
oh,
did that for most of her professional life, and there were something like 25 books in her series, and they were published in, I think, 18 languages. So so
jeez.
it's quite a. I mean, this is when IBI was coming into existence, and then the
Yeah.
International Youth Library. So it was all part of this movement, the idea that children's books could somehow have something to contribute to a peaceful world.
Huh.
So I love that, because they're not only nonfiction, but they're also books that were conceived in terms of the biggest things that were happening in the world at the time.
Well, and it's funny. I'm remembering now, even as you're talking, as a child, I didn't read nonfiction because children's nonfiction in the 80s, not the greatest. I'm just going to say it. But there was a book that I absolutely adored, which is very much in the vein of what you were just talking about,
Mhm.
A Very Young Dancer.
Oh
And
yes,
A Very
right.
Young Dancer. Yeah, that was,
Jill Krementz. Yeah.
yeah, just the
Yes.
day in the life
Yeah.
of someone in the production of the Nutcracker,
Right.
like a dancer. And I was fascinated by it as a kid. And
Exactly.
it was probably
Yeah.
the #1 nonfiction book that I read over and over as a child. And I hadn't
Right.
thought about it until just now.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it became a huge bestseller. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for a long
Yeah.
time, and I think there were at least 9 sequels.
And I
Um,
think it was
you
black and
know,
white too. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were books that, to use an overused word, empowered kids to think about what their futures could be like, and to
Yeah.
think kind of, in big terms. So
Mhm.
they had a huge impact.
Yeah. Well, that's
Absolutely. Yeah.
fascinating. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. Um, so some people, when you say photographs in picture books, what they think of is the red balloon,
Yes.
which of course, do you consider that photography, or is that just stills from the movie? And where do you
Right.
draw the line between,
Well,
I mean,
right. No, a good point. And they are stills from the movie. I mean, that's
right.
so this was a spin-off of a Academy Award winning film short from the late 50s. But I
Heartbreaker.
thought, yeah, but I mean, it's such a well-loved book that it felt like it would have been an omission not to include it in the show. And
Yeah.
that's another of the books that is in a showcase, not. We have 17 photographers represented on the walls in framed images, 97 photographs, which is a lot, and about 25 books in showcases. So you get, and I thought it's important to be able to see some of the photographs in the way they were intended to be seen, namely in the pages of a book, but then also to see them on the wall where you have more of a chance to kind of reflect on an individual image and just to notice how good it is, as photography.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't know if JT Gordon Parks, I don't know if those were stills from the television special or if those were actually his photographs. I assume those are his photographs.
That I'm not sure about. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Anyway. Yeah, fascinating. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, the only book that has ever won a Caldecott Award or honor that has had photography in it that I can think of is Knuffle Bunny, as the background, the photographic backgrounds with the drawing.
Yes.
Am I? Yeah.
I think you are right. Yeah.
Okay. Do you see in the future any possibility that a book of photography could win the Caldecott, which specifically is supposed to be for illustration? Again, we come down to this, is illustration photography kind of problem. So I don't know. I just wondered your opinion.
I mean, it all depends how you look at it, and my point of view is that photography can be illustration. It isn't always intended to be, but when it is intended to be illustration, and when it does the job really well, then I say, why not? So it really depends on people's attitudes. And I have to say, one of my hopes for this show was that it would give people a chance to think about this question, and maybe reconsider their opinion if they have come down so far on the side of photography is something else. It's not illustration.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, it's true that you're not, drawing with a pencil, and it doesn't have that layer of craft, but an awful lot of craft goes into the printing of photographs. I mean, I think it's a misconception to think that you take a picture, you get a negative, you print the photo, and that's it.
Right.
And in fact, one of the very first Victorian photographers who's recognized and fought to be recognized back in the 1850s and 60s, not for children, but for the art world at large, Henry Peach Robinson, used to combine negatives in the darkroom. He would make an image that was a composite of 9 different negatives, and that took a lot of craft, and again, it's not that different from Photoshop, what he was doing back in Victorian times. Yeah. So it's a mistake to think no craft is involved, no aesthetic craft. It's just that it occurs in different ways than we can witness, maybe as we look over the shoulder of someone at a drawing table.
Yeah, that's a good point. So the show is up until June 8th, I believe. Is there any chance of it traveling, or is it pretty much here and that's it?
We're working on that. We're putting together the proposal, and we have some, I hope, promising possibilities on the horizon. Yeah.
Okay.
I would love for that to happen. Yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah.
Oh, no problem. It's something that I would love to see it myself, but I don't travel out so much. So yeah, here's hoping it comes to the Chicago area. There you go.
Yeah. We're trying to get an airline to fly people directly from Chicago to Amherst.
Fantastic. That's all I ask.
We'll see what we could do.
Exactly.
There's no airport.
I was going to say.
Never mind. No matter.
Exactly. Well, yeah. Is there anything else you want to bring up that I didn't touch on in terms of the show, in terms of photography? I was going to say. Oh, go ahead. You go.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I just I had a storage box for 25 years filled with boxes of books, and I opened it up last year, and one of the last boxes I opened was full of photographically illustrated picture books from the 1980s and 90s. I'd completely forgotten about it, but those were books that I'd either reviewed for Parenting Magazine or set aside for possible review. So for me, it was just another marker of the fact that this has been something I've loved, pretty much all my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love photography myself, so this is great. And okay, I've got to ask it. It's the last question.
Yeah.
Is there any lonely doll in the show at all?
Oh, yes.
Oh,
Well,
thank God.
we have two first editions of the original one and one of the sequels. Yeah, and they're very. I mean, I meet so many people, almost entirely women, who say this book, changed my life when I was growing up. And they're very kind of transgressive, aren't they? I mean, they
Very
appear to
much.
be innocent stories with gingham, patterning on the jacket and so on. Very sort of girly, pink stuff. But when you really look at what's going on in the story, it's about the discovery of intense desires and the temptation to do the forbidden thing.
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
all about the things that kids are supposedly trained not to even think about, but it's all right there
Exactly.
in the stories acted out by a doll and a teddy bear.
And I would argue she was a very good photographer. There's a
Yes.
shot of the Brooklyn Bridge, which
Yeah.
to this day, I'm like, how did she get a picture with
Yeah.
nobody on it but a doll? That is
Right.
an
Yeah.
incredible image. Yeah.
Yeah.
I
Another example of someone who found her way into the children's book
Yeah.
world and she was more of an advertising photographer to
Yeah.
begin with, and had been a model before that. So, yeah.
I once found guest books New York Public Library had for all the big children's literature events, and there on one of the pages was Dare Wright's name.
Really? Oh, wow.
I know. I was like, she was there. It was fascinating.
Oh, that's great.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. Yeah. So yes. Well, thank you so much. This is fantastic. As I say, for anyone interested at all, Click Photographers Make Picture Books is currently open at the Eric Carle Museum, curated by Leonard Marcus, on view through June 7th, with the hope that maybe it'll move around some point. But if not, you should get your tuchus over there and you should see it. Leonard, thank you so much for joining us today. This was great.
Oh, this was really fun, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
No problem.